Ladies and gentlemen, you're about, you're almost at dessert, but we have the real dessert of this program coming up right now. We'd like to take advantage of the time we have, which is limited, because we can spend a lot of time on this program, particularly with the principal speakers we have. As you know, we have this practice of not introducing at any great length who they are, and that certainly applies here. I've had the opportunity of introducing a person who needs no introduction. This time I have the great privilege of introducing two people who need no introduction whatsoever. One of them, as you well know, is a financial wizard and a global philanthropist. And the other is the chap who used to run this institution in new directions. They're meeting new critical challenges and has done a wonderful job at it, and who continues as a real fighter for peace and justice on a global scale. And reflected, of course, in the name of this space, which, if I read right, says James D. Wolfenson Atrium. With that, we're going to talk about, or they're going to talk about, the future of the Bretton Woods institutions. We've heard a lot about it this morning, and we are where we are today. We're around the 70th anniversary of the Bretton Woods institutions. There's been a lot of change then. In the 70s, the big change came with abandoning the Bretton Woods system of exchange rates. And there's been recent change. We'll hear about that. But I'm sure we're all interested to see where the future will be taking us. George Soros and James Wolfenson will be dealing with this. And George, if I may ask you to begin the dialogue.
Good. I'd like to discuss the future of the Bretton Woods institutions in a broader context, a political context. We are now at a point where international cooperation is in decline, and instead of a global order, we have a global disorder. And the same applies to the financial system. The Bretton Woods institutions have lost their monopoly position, and there are two rival systems emerging. So are these two systems going to be in conflict, or will they be able to find some common ground and cooperate? How this issue is decided, I think, will have a considerable impact not only on the future of the Bretton Woods institutions, but of the world order. So that's the proposition I'll try to put to you. And I'll start with a brief historical background. During the Cold War, the world was dominated by two superpowers, each of which kept their allies and satellites under some measure of control, and went out of their way to avoid a direct military confrontation because of the mutually assured destruction, mad. So it was a mad balance, but it was a balance. And basically you had skirmishes, wars, but you did not have a world war. After the collapse of the Soviet Empire, which was imploding of its own weight, the United States had an opportunity to become the sole superpower, the hegemon of the world and the guardian of peace. But it's squandered that opportunity because there was no clear vision of what the United States' role is in the world. There was no political consensus. Basically, there were two parties that during the Cold War had a bipartisan foreign policy, but after the end of the Cold War, that bipartisanship broke up, and neither party had historically had a coherent philosophy. But on the right side, a group emerged that did have a concept and tried to get it adopted. And that was the neocons who in 1997 established or launched the project for a new American century, which was based on the thesis that since the United States had unquestioned military superiority, it should use that position to further its national advantage, and that was not a very a good idea. They managed after 9/11 to persuade President George W. Bush to attack Iraq and on false pretenses, I may say, and within a very short period of time, the United States lost its supremacy. So actually, the new American century lasted almost exactly the same length of time as Hitler's 1,000-year Reich, less than 10 years. So on the financial side, there was a consensus, which was basically based on the doctrines of efficient market hypothesis and a belief in what I call market fundamentalism. And that was the Washington consensus, and which was actually administered by the Bretton Woods institutions. But the system was inherently unstable, and the financial crisis of 2007 and 8 led to its collapse. And that 2008, the crash of 2008, was a watershed event because it happened to mark the end of American supremacy with the demise of the defeat of President Bush, it also led to the end of the Washington consensus. Um, and it was the beginning of a process of disintegration, which manifested itself first in the microcosm of the European Union, but then also in the world at large. The crash of 2008 had a lasting effect on all the economies of the world, with the notable exception of China, because there was a danger of a global depression, which was only narrowly avoided by Bernanke at the Fed, who had learned the lessons from 1930 and embraced quantitative easing. But the heavy load of debt hampered all the countries from engaging on large-scale financial stimulus. So it was a very one-sided approach. China was the exception because the Chinese banking system was isolated and state-owned. And China became the motor of the global economy, but a very small motor compared to the U.S. consumer. So there was very slow growth. But nevertheless, we avoided a repeat of the 1930s. The crash of 2008 was also responsible for the euro crisis, which eventually transformed the European Union from a voluntary association of equals, which fired the imagination of people like me, to something radically different, relationship between creditors and debtors, where the debtors had difficulty in meeting their obligations, and the creditors set the rules, and that resulted in an association that was neither voluntary nor equal. The euro crisis was eventually resolved. The euro continuation was assured by Draghi doing whatever it takes to maintain the euro, with the support of Chancellor Merkel. But it left behind political problems. So since then, the problem of the euro has become the problem of the European Union, and that was the process of disintegration that was started then after 2008. The United States also became preoccupied by its domestic problems, but by a different route, because the Republican Party never abandoned the demise of the market fundamentalism, and President Obama and his part was preoccupied with domestic issues, and I think he made a big mistake because the Constitution gives the President much greater powers in international affairs than in domestic affairs, where it's subordinated to the Congress, and so he couldn't achieve very much. But at any rate, the inward turn of the two Western powers led to decline in international cooperation. When you think of it, both the Copenhagen Climate Summit and the WTO Doha round of trade negotiations didn't produce any they came to naught. And political and military conflicts festered and multiplied. Maybe the crises were solvable by themselves, but they were all interconnected, and the losers in one crisis became the spoilers in the other crisis. So the crises were not resolved. They started in the Middle East with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. From there, it spread to the greater Middle East, and then to Europe, and even Africa now. And in Europe, you actually have indirectly an indirect war between Russia and the Western allies in Ukraine, although neither the public nor the leadership fully realize this fact. Now I think much depends on how China manages the transition from an export and investment-led economy to a domestic led growth. And if the transition runs into roadblocks, then there is a chance or likelihood, in fact, that the leadership would foster some external conflict to keep the country united and maintain itself in power. And if there is a military conflict between China and an ally of the United States, like Japan, then it perhaps not too much, not an exaggeration to say that we may be on the threshold of a third world war. And in fact, there is now rapid growth in the armament, spending on armaments in Russia. Is now spending 10% of its GDP on armaments, and also in China. And of course, the United States still has military superiority, but it's maybe diminishing somewhat. And the world has broken up into rival camps, both financially and politically. Now the big question is, will they be able to keep the rivalry within bounds? I think that is now the pressing question. And here, I think the Bretton Woods institutions could play a major role. because uh, they have abandoned their commitment to market fundamentalism. But the controlling shareholders have been reluctant to abandon their control. This was a very short-sighted development or action on their part because it doesn't take into account in the change in the relative strength of the various economies, and particularly the rise of China. And China has begun to build a set of rival institutions, the AIIB and the Qingmai clearing system. You might talk about a Beijing consensus, but it certainly does not necessarily include China's neighbors, who are looking more to the United States for support. So you do now have these rival institutions, and I think there is an opportunity to build a binding connection between the two systems, because the controlling shareholders are not going to abandon their control, however tenuous it is, but the SDR, special drawing rights, are coming up for their 5-yearly review, and there's a possibility to include the renminbi. Although it's not fully qualified, but the qualifications are more flexible than generally believed. Now, the United States would be making a major concession if it allowed, by allowing the renminbi to make a step forward in becoming a potential rival of the dollar. So China would have to make similarly major concessions. And there are many things wrong with the Chinese system. The Chinese leadership doesn't abide by the rule of law. There is no independent judiciary. And the multinationals are very often mistreated and even not expropriated, but replaced by domestic favorites. And there are other problems like things connected with the cyber warfare. So these are areas where China would have to be willing to make concessions. So this would involve a very tough negotiations, but I think it is in the interest of both parties to find an accommodation, because the alternative is so unpleasant. And there has been a major breakthrough in the area of climate policy. There needs to be a similar breakthrough in cooperation on economic matters, because without it, there's a real danger that China will align itself with Russia politically and militarily. And then the threat of a third war will become real. So it's worth trying.
Thank you, George. That was a real global tour d'horizon. Yes, something to.
I think Dick is trying to introduce me, but he's so nervous that he can't do it. But I am to speak after George, which is very difficult. Along with all of you, I'm fascinated by both the historic analysis that George has given us in relation to the emergence of two systems. After the Cold War, the two global powers, but with no clear vision of the US at that time. We had hopes of a new American century, but it didn't emerge as we had hoped. And the crisis of 2008 certainly gave us all food for thought in terms of how the system was going to operate. And I think that it would be foolish for me to try and add to the perceptions of George Soros, who I've admired for so long and who's been a leader in thinking on these subjects. So I'm going to pick up on the starting point, which is by the time we have resolved the current conflicts, where we've seen China and the US hopefully come together, that Russia becomes more quiescent, and where we start looking beyond this current series of developments to where we're going. And here, I was reminded when I came to the bank today that when I was here, we were talking about a global world of 6 billion people at the time of the year 2000, which was right midpoint of my presidency. That the billion people in the developed world and the rich world had 80% of global income, a little less. It had been eroded for the few years before the year 2000, and the other 5 billion had 20% of global income. And that, of course, included China and India. And that was a comfortable feeling if you were president of the World Bank, because you were elected by the rich guys and you felt comfortable in your job. And that had been the case for decades before, with an American running this institution and a European running the institution across the street. Well, I think you all know, and it was hinted at by George, that that is changing. But the extent of the change is something that I'd like to spend a couple of minutes on, because I think it's very important in relation to the solution of existing issues and projecting forward, particularly when you see that there are now two international financial institutions, and there's probably an expectation that there might be more. And the reason for the creation of that institution is that the old shareholders were not prepared to change the degree of control which they'd historically exercised. And Christine Lagarde, who was here this morning, made every effort to try and get the institutions to change, to get the shareholders to change, but there was intransigence, particularly on the part of the United States. And the result is that you now have extra institutions, and it's my guess it will have probably quite a number more. And as we look at it today, we got 7.3, 7.4 billion people in 2015, and the expectations are that by 2050 we'll have 9.25 billion. But the fascinating thing is that the billion that I grew comfortable with at the year 2000 will grow maybe to 1,250,000,000, to 1,300,000,000. The 5 billion in the developing world will grow to in excess of 8 billion. So on the one side you have an addition of 3+ billion people, and on the other side, in the so-called rich world, you have 250 million in this next period. And that brings with it lots and lots of changes. Just to think of a few. Africa, which when I started my tenancy here in 1995 had 500-600 million people, now approaching 1 billion. By 2050 is 2.2 billion. It will be 20% of the world's population and more. And projecting forward to the year 2100, it'll be north of 30% of global population. That's something which my generation has found difficult to accept if they know that this is what's going to happen. Christianity has been the largest religion in the Western world, and Islam will grow maybe in 2050 to something close to 20% of global religions. By 2100, probably north of 30%, certainly outstripping Christianity as the next religion. So if you just take those two things, if you say you're going to have a world by 2100 in which 1/3 of the world population is African, and the largest religious group is Islam, and the interesting thing about Islam, which you all know, is that it is a global religion and pretty well connected. The other thing which has happened since I first got here was that the world is now connected. I remember going first to a village in Kenya, and after having been made a chief of the tribe in this little village with mud pavements, the chief said to me, "Do you want to come and see our computer?" And I said, "Sure." And I went in, and there in a hut were 2 young men with 2 IBM computers, one of them looking at coffee prices, and this is true, the other one reading the New York Times. And I said to him, could I just look at the New York Times? And I had the experience of looking at the New York Times in a little village in Kenya. And I thought, this is progress. They also were getting out their information on coffee prices to people with earphones that cost the farmer $2.50. So when the traders came in to tell them something about the prices, the guy in the village was more up to date than they were because he'd just got the latest prices. And I need hardly tell you that with the explosion of cell phones, the issue for young people today is much less national environment than it is youth in a region. If you looked at the Egyptian uprisings and the problems that changed the government, it was fascinating to see here on television young people in other countries in the Middle East commenting on the Egyptian developments because they'd been connected by cell phones. And if you go to universities today, whereas when many of us were there were national clubs, now it's a Middle Eastern club or it's a Latin American club. It is a regional club because the national boundaries are being taken away by technology. And with 53 countries in Africa, the Africans now represent 53 different countries. Not, by the way, all in terrific political or economic shape. That's a separate issue. But in terms of coming together, we have a very different world which we are confronting. And I believe that that is the case and will be the case. And you'll have China as the #1 power. We'll have the US for a period number 2, and then thirdly, India. One of the top 10 countries in the world, certainly on a purchasing power basis, 6 of them will be from developing countries. I'm sketching this, but you could get into it. But the reason that I'm saying it is that I think as we look at what is going on currently, as George has done immaculately in terms of what are the immediate questions, you need to have behind it a sense of where all this is going. The issues are immediate, but the view that we need to take, especially for our kids, is long term. Chinese have 425,000 new students going abroad this year, of whom 215,000, well, last year, 215,000 came to the United States. The United States sent a grand total of 11,000 students to China. India had 125,000 students come here. We had less than 10,000 students go to India. If you go to a degree ceremony certainly in an Eastern university today, and you see the PhD students, half of them are Asian. When they stand up, it's very clear that they're Asians. This is all happening now and has a huge impact on where we're going. And it's my belief that this institution, the World Bank, can play an enormously important role in not entering the politics of this, but in making sure that the world is conscious of these mega trends, which will happen. I may be off 10% or 15%. Maybe it's not, maybe the African population is not 35%, it's 28.6%. It doesn't matter. The numbers are just different from what we've talked about. And for me, the great challenge that faces this institution and faces all of us is to prepare ourselves to bring this next generation of young people into a set of understandings about where the hell we're going. We're failing in our task to educate the next generation. We're just failing. I sometimes talk about this subject. Occasionally, very occasionally, I get asked to speak somewhere. And when I'm asked, there's always a man comes up and says, you know, I'm fascinated by what you said, and I have a son who is just graduating, and I'm going to go home and talk to him about this, and going to make sure he spends a period of time in China or in India, focuses himself a little bit on Asia. He then goes and plays golf, and you're quite certain after the weekend that it's not a subject that he's going to return to. But there is a need for people, as in this room, first of all, to come to an understanding of this direction, if you believe it, and I believe it's true, get an understanding of where the issues are likely to be. And by the way, I have not touched the Sunni-Shia issue. I have not touched the Iran issue. The Palestinian-Israeli issue has been mentioned, but it's tiny. It's 11, 12 million people in an Arab community now, 400 million, which will grow to 700 or 800 million, while the 11 million will grow to 20 million. It's a peanut. It's very important for many people symbolically, but the numbers are overwhelming. And as is the issue of Sunni-Shia governance and how the stability is returned to the region. So I could go on and on about my list of longer-term issues, which I will never understand as well as George understands the current issues, but which worry me largely because by the time I'm no longer on this planet, you will know the truth and you won't have been able to come back to me and say, you got it all wrong, Jim. But I know directionally that what I'm saying is critical. And I believe that for institutions such as this and the fund, and I've talked to Christine Lagarde about these issues, we are at a moment or a period of change which is unlike anything that we've seen before. You will remember that in 1800, the East and the West, for the last time, had equal GDP. And then it changed, and then, as I'm sure you know, the East dropped down, particularly China and India, and at one point China and India together were under 5% of global GDP. And so there's been a resurgence. But it's unlikely that we will ever be equal again, because the population will be 8 billion against 1.25 billion. And technology is now mobile. So I think that for our next generation, we're moving to a new level of issues. How do we train our young people to understand this new reality? What are we doing to give them education? What are we doing in our educational system to be aware of these realities? What are the priorities that we have? What is happening to research? What is happening to the environment? What is happening to the role of women? All those things. But I've perhaps gone on too long, but I wanted very much to say to this group that in addition to the extraordinary analysis that George gave of our current situation and the coming together, the necessary coming together of China with the West, I think we can give a bit of thought to this next 35 or 65 years, because one way or another that direction is not going to change, although the numbers I've given you may be out 10 or 15%. Thank you.
Well, I must say, you both posited. Sorry, I'm not plugged in. Am I with you? Yes, thank you. I must say, for a little luncheon get-together, we've seen quite a few challenges posited for us and the world in general. And I guess one of the questions one would ask is, looking at all these challenges, what kind of role would the Bretton Woods institutions play in them? And Jim has just described the role of the World Bank, and the fund for that matter, as playing a more active role. The question is, along what lines? What prospects are there for getting the benefits of the Bretton Woods system applicable to what you described, both of you described? George, you have a comment on that?
Well, as I said, I think they could play a very important role in preventing being, let's say, put into the ghetto of rich nations. And the World Bank certainly has been very much involved in problems of development. I think the IMF actually has been the leader in rejecting the false premises on which the Washington Consensus was originally built, rejecting market fundamentalism, recognizing that, for instance, absolutely free capital movements can be destabilizing, and altogether that the system, instead of assuring the optimum allocation of resources, is crisis prone and inherently unstable, and it needs some form of regulation. So the IMF has been, I think, in the forefront in what I call new economic thinking. I mentioned the renminbi issue with the SDRs, and I think it could create a link between the two systems and bring it together and make sure that the rivalry, which is inevitable and is part of human nature, is part of the Washington consensus itself, is within bounds, and that there are rules which guide what how the rivalry plays out. Unfortunately, I mean, I've been talking mainly about China and the need to find an accommodation with China. You do have a problem with Russia, because Russia has broken the rules, and now it's not, one has to be aware that that's not necessarily Russia. That's Putin's Russia. Would be a big mistake to equate the strategic interests of Russia with the strategic interests of the Putin regime. And I think one has to reject the Putin regime and stand up to the Putin regime that has violated the norms, the values and standards that are the foundation of the European Union and generally the Western world, without being hostile to the Russian people, who are just as eager for individual freedom as the people of Russia, of Ukraine. And if given a chance, they would be very happy to be part of the new Ukraine that wants to get closer to Europe. So I think there is a need for international cooperation, strengthening of international cooperation, but at the same time refusing to accept those who break the rules and introduce the rule of force as opposed to the rule of law.
You seem to be promoting, George, the idea of an open society.
Well,
if I may use that phrase.
yes.
I personally think that the bank and the fund, which have such an amazing set of resources and research available to them, as well as coverage of shareholders, should undertake a study of the world of 2050 and the world of 2100. There is excellent work done in the bank. I'm not so familiar with the fund's work, done on elements of these questions, about what education is like in the next 30 years, about what healthcare challenges might be, what are the needs for infrastructure. But what I think would be enormously valuable would be to have, as a center, the bank working cooperatively with other international institutions, not competitively, with the Asian Development Bank, with the African Bank, trying to come up under whatever banner it is called, with a global assessment of where the hell we're going. Because too much of the work that we do today, particularly amongst our leaders, is 3 to 5 years ahead, or even 3 weeks ahead. What is necessary is for someone to come together and say, look, we're not sure where the world is going over these next period. But let's take a tiny fraction of our research and a tiny fraction of our brightest people to take a look with all the particular skills that we have in these institutions at the direction of our world for the next 50 years. I think it would be fascinating, more than being an academic study, it would be a base to which we could refer when individual decisions are being made. That does not exist today. That simply does not exist. And it's sort of crazy when you ask businesses to project forward for 5 years or 10 years, when you have global institutions where the interests are significantly longer term and where the changes are going to be enormous. Can you imagine a world where Islam is the dominant religion? Can you imagine a world where the largest agglomeration of people is Africa? You can argue with me whether it's 25 or 30% of the global population, but it's of that order. What are we going to do about it? What is there to do about it? What does it require today in terms of thinking to allow us to educate our kids, to educate ourselves about these coming realities? And I think it would be a perfectly remarkable thing to do. Maybe the Soros Foundation should do this itself. Yeah. but someone needs to be doing it. And as I sink into senility, it's something I hope that someone younger and with a better mind can address.
Well, if I may just interject, I would be very careful about talking about Islam as if it was one religion. Not only is there a difference between Sunni and Shia, but there's really the problem, the political problem, comes from the Wahhabi tribe, which is a particular tribe, happens to be in Saudi Arabia, who have been close allies of the United States. But, we are outraged by beheadings by ISIS, but beheadings occur in Saudi Arabia on the same, with greater frequency than by ISIS. But that's an extreme, and it's a particular outgrowth of one particular sect, if you like. And you have Sufi, which is very, 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 has the same values as Christianity. And of course, Christianity has also in the past engaged in some excesses. And there are some excesses in Christianity right now in this country that I wouldn't like to talk about now. The Islam is a very broad cover, and it would be a mistake, just as it's a mistake to, let's say, acquaint the Putin regime with the Russian people. The same about the excesses of a particular extreme within Islam, with the Islamic.
I just want to be clear. I was not trying to demonize Islam. If I can say, some of my best friends are Muslim. But the point I'm making is that if there is a third of the world that is Islamic, that is a different world than the world we have today.
Yeah, but you see, it reflects on us that we think we have some universal values, but we tend to think of ourselves as the, let's say, the depository of those values, and we are not used to a world where there are other people who are just equal to us. We, in Orwell's phrase, we are a little more equal than the others, right? And that's has been, let's say, the history of the Bretton Woods institutions. When you come to think of it, Keynes had the idea of Bancor, which is a neutral currency, but the power was in the hands of the United States, and it was the dollar that became the privileged currency. Now it's losing that privilege. We have a tough time accommodating to it. And that's why I think it was very short-sighted to try to keep the Bretton Woods institutions as let's say, a Western enclave, because you now have rivals coming up, and they have considerable power behind them. So we do need genuinely international relations and international institutions for a world order.
I just want to repeat, George, when I was at this institution, of my top 10 people, one was American,
Right.
only one. And secondly, I repeat again, I was not trying to cast any moral judgment on Islam. I think Islam is a fine religion, and I am not trying to dramatize it. I'm just saying that if a third of the global population is Islamic, it is different than today. And we will see what the implications are. It may be that we all become Muslim, and my grandfather might turn in his grave if I were to do that, but Jews and Muslims have lived together for millennia, so I guess it's not too far for me to move. But it's a small point, the Islamic one, but the point about Black Africa is a real one. I'm not making any aspersions about Black Africans either. I'm merely saying that the balance in the world is likely to change. And what I would love to see happen is to have a group of people from the international institutions come together and explore the world 30 or 40 years from now from the different angles that they bring. The World Bank, the Asian Development Bank, the Arab Bank, everybody, just to take a coordinated look at what is likely to happen. And so far as I know, no international effort has been made. Individual people have written about it. I'm just reading a book now that McKinsey put out for its anniversary, or McKinsey Research did, and I'm halfway through it, and it doesn't quite answer the questions. But I'm hoping it will, but the second half of the book. But I don't want to make too big a point of it, just that I think in this institution, and since this may be the last time I'm invited to speak here, I thought I would make the point. And it's getting close to 2 o'clock, and I know people have to leave. Mr. Chairman.
No, we want to stay here, and we'd love to hear you speak for another couple of hours, is what we'd like to do. But unfortunately, we are reaching a point.
How about some questions?
Sorry?
Some questions.
Yeah, I think who will be privileged to ask the first and perhaps the last question? But if you would you please stand? Well, we have 2. Microphone, name, please.
Sure.
And all very nice, loud, and clear.
All right. My name is
slow.
Bernadette Palo, and I'm the president of the Africa Society of the National Summit on Africa in Washington, D.C. So I'm very pleased with this discourse on Africa. Mr. Soros, I know of your work on the continent, and Mr. Wolfenson, I think that your remarks were right on point. With respect to the Bretton Woods Committee, it's very important that this issue of trade facilitation be connected to our national security interests. You see now that the Senate has passed the Africa Growth and Opportunity Act, which wasn't mentioned today, as a trade bill, and it's now at the House. It affects 44 countries in Africa. And this notion then that the poorer countries don't have a equal playing field, and billions of people are languishing now in Africa, giving rise to Boko Haram, Al-Shabaab, Al-Qaeda in the Maghreb, and ISIS that we now see in Egypt. My question to you is then, what do we do? Do we rely on our military assets in helping those countries, in addition to increasing trade and investment? Thank you.
Thank you.
The
Before we have a response, could we have the final question, if you don't mind? Are you up? Would you like to speak? I thought your hand was up. Oh, hold on one second. The microphone.
There are other questions.
Mr. Chairman, I had the same kind of question. My name is Diego. I come from Kenya. Has been mentioned before. Thank you very much. Has it been decided, particularly by the European Union, that the solution in future for Africa is to put it back as into colonial status? As you can see, the West Africa has already gone back to France. The East Africa has gone back to kind of status emanating from South Africa.
Okay. Well, let me answer first very simply that political issues don't have a military solution. So the emphasis on military solutions is absolutely the wrong one. And when you think of what's happening, for instance, with the migrants in the Mediterranean, etc., you have to have some humanitarian standards, human rights, and people have rights, and certainly in Africa, coming to your issue, the Africans have been colonial. The old colonial powers have kind of recognized their mistakes. Now China has moved into Africa. The colonial powers came looking for natural resources. The citizens or the local people were maybe a source of cheap labor, but not of any concern. They have realized this was a mistake. The Chinese have come looking also for natural resources, and they are actually, in doing it, committing some of the mistakes that the old colonial powers did. But I hope that they'll see that and actually instead of just looking for exploitation of natural resources, which indirectly is the exploitation of the local people to whom those resources really belong. There will be now a better treatment, and I have certainly been very much in the forefront of better governance for natural resources. It's one of the most promising innovations, if you like, in governance. It's because the wealth is there, but the people don't get the benefits. And I think if they get more of the benefits, then they can develop better. So I don't think that Africa is going to be relegated to colonial status.
As I said, we could use several more hours of these gentlemen's views, but unfortunately, we are limited, and I think it's time to thank them both for their great contribution.
Thank you.
And I also would like to thank, on behalf of the Bretton Woods Committee, our sponsor for this annual meeting, which is SICPA Holdings. And I want to thank the World Bank staff for providing us with this wonderful, wonderfully named place, the atrium of JDW. And to thank our Bretton Woods Committee staff as well for their good job in this, which I think is a good job. Thank you all for coming. We help you support.